There are specific tables for these topics, but there are two things that we kind of want everybody to keep in mind as you're discussing whatever it is that you're discussing. The first is that any solutions that we're coming up with today really ought to be in line with Indigenous rights, which includes inherent title to the land. That's something that is people are talking about a lot. It's pretty non-negotiable. So that's something that we have an Indigenous rights table, but if we're talking about renewable energy implementation, energy poverty, transportation, that's something that we should be keeping in mind. And the other one is pertaining to labor rights and a just transition. I think we're all aware that an awful lot of people in this province depend on oil, coal, and gas for employment. But that's why we really need to be making a plan for this transition. So we should be considering ways that we can, not leave any of those workers behind as part of this transition. And again, we do have a just transition table, but I'd encourage everybody to just keep that in mind, whatever it is that you're discussing. And remember that you don't have to agree on everything, but do try to agree on a few things that we can report back to the big group. We'll also have a note taker at each table, and we're hoping that a CJS member will be available at each table for that. But if you don't end up with a note taker, please let us know and we'll arrange for one. I think that might be it for now. So have fun.
By not letting these pipelines through. They're already on board. It's just the government that needs to be on board and not try to push these pipelines through.
Proportion of our industry, the industry workers work outside the border in Alberta. They too are against export pipelines because
the municipal action, gatherings such as this and policies that are going to be dealt. That's an apparatus that's on a scale that can move a little bit more nimbly and is more susceptible.
And over time, those caps are supposed to be reduced, so you have an overall reduction in emissions. I have a hint.
Haven't does have the track record that it worked pretty well for acid rain reduction. This is a policy that came out of Mulroney and Reagan. It has worked before, and frustratingly, like the carbon tax itself, it was this kind of right-wing idea that has now been rejected by people who invented it. The idea is that you're trying to use market forces to help drive innovation.
That's true that what people do individually is what adds up to the total of what's happening.
Well, I think densification is a really important issue that's related to that, but that also, one of the issues with that is the fact that we have these developers who are in this province who are subsidized by the province, and private transportation, let's face it, is also receives a tremendous subsidy from the province.
And we all pay for it.
And we all
pay the taxes for the highways and streets. I just spent a month in Victoria, where they are, and I realize Victoria's got lots of problems, but when they build, when they do infill, they build really attractive, people-sized infill. So there'll be a section of townhouses or a section of 2 or 3-story apartment buildings, and part of it's because they're on an earthquake zone and they don't build a lot of high-rises, but they're attractive and they all look different and they fit into the community so much better.
The people that are kind of the winners are actually not the farmers in this instance. They're the chemical companies, the machinery companies, and so on. And they're basically using the farmer to take wealth out of the province.
But unless the farmers want to change, because I don't know how many farmers are here. There's no farmers at this table.
So have you already decided?
No, I'm in support of it. I am. I've realized the other side, and there's not many farmers here that are saying, yeah, I want to switch over to. There's none at our table. So it's
you're talking to a certified
sorry.
farmer.
Yeah.
And we actually are more viable Our farm is 2/4 sections. Half of it's cultivated.
Is it being discussed enough with university students that are going to be our next leaders?
All right. Hey, everybody. It's having a good time. So because there was time only to sit at 2 tables, we wanted to provide the last half hour as an opportunity to share what was shared at those tables. So we're going to kind of go in turn. Hopefully you've still got notes. Ideally, there was a note taker for every table. And if they don't mind coming up to share with the mic, that would be great. But we'll just go in turn. I'm going to invite Janelle up first to share from the Indigenous Rights table.
Okay, hello everybody. Kind of got roped into being a note taker and resource, but that's okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate being heard and asked to be here. So we were doing Indigenous Rights, Justice, and Reconciliation table, and we had such great topics, discussions come out of it, so a lot of realizations, a lot of connections to different dynamics beyond climate change. So I appreciate that. So one of the first things that we kind of discussed, and well, with the first group, and we discussed quite a bit with the second group, is the idea of Indigenous being its own column. So now we have agriculture, renewable energy, and all these different columns of ways of thought. But then our issue arose in the fact that Indigenous is its own column. Now, Indigenous should be in all different columns, all different themes, incorporated into everything, so that we're clumping things into Indigenous over here and renewable over here. That's a problematic way of thinking, maybe, and that we just need to advance and think of Indigenous as in every piece that we're doing here. So that's something that we need to move forward from. Another one is, and it's separate from climate change, but not, is this idea of racism. Racism is this power dynamic that, you know, you're better than someone, or you're different from someone, and that someone is less than you. No, that power dynamic happens with the way we see the land, and this commodification of the land. It's the way we see peoples from different classes or areas or different levels of income. That's how we see it with people with binary genders and non-binary genders. You know, they're less than us. So a tangible word is racism, a power dynamic that something's less than. And how do we counter that? Lauryn Hill says, get right within. How are you going to win if you ain't right within? So like being aware and unlearning that thought process, which will also give way to making relationships in our community, something that we need to work on. This idea of reconciliation, you know, building better relationships, is eliminating racism, countering misinformation, working on ourselves consistently so that everyone is equal. And then lastly, in our talks, we're tying into having the right resources or relationships. So honoring treaty. Treaty is this foundational document here in the country. If we don't understand it, it's a good time to learn about treaty. Right now, treaty is under attack due to this new land regiment that Canada is proposing, this municipalization of Indigenous nations. So if you were to municipalize Indigenous nations, you're therefore like eliminating treaty, eliminating this relationship, eliminating, and then it's this snowball effect, because if you eliminate treaty, then Indigenous people don't have a nation-to-nation right in this country. So that's something to think about, is that if we want to protect the climate, we need to protect Indigenous peoples and the rights, because Indigenous rights are some of the last living environmental rights in this country. With the omnibus bill, what's left is Indigenous rights to protect the environment. So it's integral that we are opposed to the municipalization of Indigenous nations. And although some Indigenous nations want this, I don't know if they understand the outcome of that. But you see that in the States with what they did in the 50s with the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act gave rights, ownership to Indigenous peoples who were poor, needed the money, who sold off their reserve lands. And now you have this little tiny checkerboard looking for a First Nations community in the States. That's what Canada is on track to doing to our Indigenous peoples. And also, I guess lastly is there's a binary of like ceded lands and unceded lands, and it's kind of an offshoot. But recognizing that there are lands that are covered by treaty, which is this territory, and then you have lands that are not covered by treaty, and that to say that Indigenous peoples are pan-Canadian, have certain rights, no, it's not true. I can speak from a treaty perspective as a treaty status First Nations person, but there are differences, and so that it's going to be complicated and messy, and with countering racism, we're going to get a lot of pushback because, you know, the powerful don't like to lose power. So it's going to be messy, but it's important and integral because it's not our world anymore. It's our children's children, maybe, if you're lucky. So that's it. That's it for our side. We had so much more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just want it for all the tables again, we do want to take your notes and comments both to kind of construct a report and make new policy recommendations in that, just so those outcomes are clear.
So this is from the first round of international responsibility. What could Saskatchewan do in terms of international responsibility? So one of the things that our group came up with was raise awareness about climate change via existing humanitarian organizations. And then we had a short discussion about which organizations might be willing and able to help with that raising awareness effort. And there are a whole bunch of international things that have been suggested. One of them is having a declaration on the rights of the earth, and that would be parallel to some of the United Nations ideas about the rights of Indigenous people, the rights of children, and so on. And so this would be rights of the earth. Another thing that could be done in Saskatchewan, that is obviously, this came up in other discussions too, that the public is wanting education about the issues, climate issues, and so on, and how on earth is that awareness going to be promoted, and what would be we did not come up with any specific ideas about that, but there is a need.
Thank you. You, sir. So you jumping up, you here to share? Coming up next. Sure. Okay, sorry, sir.
Since we're on the same topic of international responsibility, So the second table that talked about international responsibility said Saskatchewan needs to stop subsidizing the extractive industry and increase taxes to the extractive industries, and that these funds should be invested in renewables, better transportation options, and some of them should go internationally to fund reducing damages to the less wealthy nations who are being the most impacted by climate change. We also talked about Indigenous peoples needing to be consulted and listened to. And we talked about, on a municipal level, having more programs like pushing for composting and things that are more accessible to people in their everyday lives.
Okay, Lisa, you're up.
Thank you for having me. Okay, so I'm talking for renewable energy. So we talked about several things. I had 27 things, but I'm going to try to say them in 3 things. Right, Mark knows. Okay, so improve infrastructure. These would include things like buildings and building codes. One of the great opportunities is to reduce the demand for energy in order to move towards energy efficiency. We think of the grid, what's going into it and what's coming out of it is really important. So for instance, one of our participants talked about going in the transportation group, and right now, if you had an electric car in Saskatchewan, you would increase your emissions by having an electric car because you were plugging it into the grid. Virtual net metering. This is an idea that, say you don't have a prime location for solar panels, for example, yourself. You could have a solar panel out somewhere where it's more sunny. You would be connected in a virtual way so that you don't have to have a solar panel at your house, and then the meter could record the energy that you're generating into the grid. And then variable complements was big, so we heard that at the beginning about wind and solar together as building a more robust renewable capacity. And then also the idea of when we're building new neighborhoods, we're building infrastructure on a very old model that includes the buildings, but what if you built energy efficiency into the neighborhoods? So an example was I think it was in Sweden, where they have neighborhoods where they have biomass, wind, and solar together. Then you have that variability together. The second area that was kind of a really good point was to understand that crown corporations are there for the public good, that they're supposed to be our corporations, which I think is an interesting point. So this idea that you're somehow rooting the profitability of Sask Power if you're feeding clean energy into the grid, that's the wrong logic. That's a real failure of the imagination. And a prime example would be, in terms of imagination also, is to understand the age of our grid as an opportunity, and rather than renewing it, using that language of renewal to indicate rebuilding something based on dirty technology, you could rebuild it based on green technology. And then the third area that I'm just putting together is policy and taxation structures. And as we just heard, there's this we're doing things kind of the reverse of what they should be. So we're incentivizing, dirty energy, if you will, and we're de-incentivizing renewables. But the point of policy and tax should be the reverse when you take into account the larger picture that we heard about tonight. So 3 points.
Thank you, Chris. Bonnie, come up for the agriculture table.
Yes, we were talking about agriculture, and the discussion was good and very wide-ranging and very difficult to summarize. But the first point is we feel as though agriculture is a keystone industry in Saskatchewan, but the provincial climate change policies are very weak, and we want stronger policies. Second, again, the same idea, to use incentives and disincentives to change the existing system. So as a disincentive would be to disincentivize the use of fertilizers. One idea was to remove the PST exemption. But these are the things that we spent more time on, and that was what we wanted to incentivize. So we want new models to diversify the agriculture that we have. We want an increase in local food, expansion of farmers' markets, something called new generational cooperatives, which I heard about for the first time. Very exciting. Organic farming, recognition of the value of natural areas, especially wetlands, native grasslands, and specifically there was mentioned short rotation or mob grazing techniques that actually help with the carbon sequestration. And some concern about carbon credits that some of the information was that they don't work very well. There's some problems, but certainly there was a question whether zero till should be considered for carbon credits. And last of all, to reform the financial system in order to fund our diversified agriculture.
Transportation. Is this transportation table? Right on.
Okay, yeah. I'll try to be brief. I was at the first session of the transportation, and we concentrated very much on the municipal government part of it. I think there was a feeling at our table generally that our present city council maybe is much more progressive than we've had for a while, and to support things that they do that are positive would be a good way. We're thinking of how to change the culture, basically, I guess, to support positive actions of the city council, promoting public transit, for instance, densification, and maybe disincentivizing the growth out at the perimeter. Maybe in the past, the city council and developers have been a little bit too close, and it should be more for the people. And I guess another thing was to work against a low tax regime. Like if nobody wants to pay taxes, how do we expect to get any public services? I think that's kind of the basics of it.
All right, thanks. Maybe somebody from that just transition table?
One thing that we thought would be a great way to lobby the federal government is to actually get the Canadian pension plan to invest in renewable energies. Right now, a lot of unions invest in their pension plans into oil and gas and things that, don't make sense for our environment. So that might be one way to, if you're not in a union member, lobby for CPP to be invested properly. In terms of policy, of course, we want to see the end of subsidies and royalties to oil and gas and use that money towards retraining. And also, this is another federal one, though, to enhance EI. In Alberta, they've got an organization called Iron and Earth, which is led by oil sands workers, and we'd love to see something similar here. And also, there's tons of jobs to be created just from the cleanup of wells, right? Like there's lots that can be done there, and making sure that it's actually the oil and gas companies that pay for that. And the second conversation, we got more into creating incentives for individuals to start planning their own community gardens and kind of take away that multinational ownership of putting food on your table. And we had a representative from the National Farmers Union, so it all kind of connected into agriculture and jobs. But yeah, I think I'll keep it short because I know we're running out of time.
Great job.
So I was with the carbon pricing table, and I would say that we got into both specifics and broad themes, and I'll share some of the broad themes and tensions first across the two tables. And one of those was just the challenges of designing good policy with all the politics involved and with the public education and communication component to this piece. And I'd say underlying in terms of both challenges and opportunities, I would call these the 4 C's, though this only came out after, so this is a bit of an editorial here, but consumption, capitalism, colonialism, and community. Those for sure came out. We talked a little bit about that kind of where do we impose the carbon price and about upstream imposition versus downstream. But both groups tended more towards talking about the how do we distribute this carbon price, because we accept it as a fundamental that we do want some form of carbon pricing involved in this. And one of the things that came out in the groups is that there needs to be buy-in demonstrated here and some debate around, do we impose or do we distribute this initially with more kind of checks flowing out to people and then transition more into funding green infrastructure, or do we go hard at funding green infrastructure right away? An important part of that was the equity piece, and that no matter how the distribution works, it has to be equitable, it has to be a progressive and not a regressive system. So I think I'll leave it there, and there's probably things I missed, but that's for the full report.
And thanks for bringing that up. We are going to produce a report, so you'll get to read all the things. even if we don't have time to hear them all tonight. Is there no taker from the energy poverty table that would love to share? Megan?
So I was part of the conversation for the first round, and I don't want to take up too much space, so I'll just kind of outline kind of our 3 policy suggestions that we had. The first was, I think this is a common theme, but eliminating subsidies to the oil and gas industries and redirecting those to low-income folks, which could be used in a variety of ways, like providing, those services that are needed, but in an eco-friendly way, like, focusing on transportation and opportunities that are cheap and efficient, like good bus system, rail system, programs like car share programs. All of these things can help. And we had a big discussion about requiring building retrofits and providing incentives. It's easy to put in those requirements for new builds, but to have those like conversations about how we're going to make buildings that already exist eco-friendly, but also affordable for low-income folks. So that was sort of the main points. Thanks.
How badly do we want to hear that second agriculture report? So let's hear it. I got a lot of boos for that one, so I've got like a minute.
Thanks. Okay, so there were 2 discussions I was part of, and we've got 3 outcomes for each, so I'll just read them off really quickly. The first group, we said encourage native prairie habitat, as well as define what that is and what that looks like. The second point, we spent a long time talking about meat production in the province. So our outcome is, as a society, we need to strive to eat and produce less industrially raised meat. I think I said that all. And then the third point was around the decommodification of land, reforming land tenure to reduce the pressure to maximize output and profit on land. So we talked about land trust, ownership, Indigenous land rights, and capitalism in that discussion. It was a great discussion. Second group, first recommendation is publicly funded organic farming. Second recommendation is to get ag business out of education, specifically in funding education, so that organic practices can be learned about. And the third point, we talked a lot about nitrogen and how we can look at that emissions. So we talked about a pricing system for nitrogen, taking away PST exemptions for fertilizers, as well as promoting legumes as nitrogen fixers. So that was the point.
Well done. Oh yeah, and if we can get all those notes handed in to us, that would be really helpful. So make sure to give them to Mark, holding up his hand. You all know Mark. Thanks again. Sorry that we don't have time to continue this. I know we were having super energetic discussions, which is great. Once we all get together, we can talk forever. So let's do this again sometime.
We hope that you learned something new this evening and that you enjoyed the opportunity to build something good together. As of now, the event is formally closed. Thank you and safe trip home.